Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Thursday, August 7th, 2025. We're going to be looking into the 2026 United States gubernatorial elections. We're going to specifically be going over every single race, no matter how competitive they are. We're going to be going in order of expected competitiveness based on the expected margins as of right now. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to power reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure to follow us on Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X to be able to get news as soon as it comes out. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, to start things off here, we do have the entire list of all of these states that are up for election in 2026. Not all of them are up. And here we have our blank map. Now it's 8 to 6 with the current holdings plus a flip in Virginia, as based on the odds on Kalshi, the most likely scenario is that the Democrats do end up winning both races in New Jersey and Virginia. So that's the assumption that we're going off of for the overall for this map as of right now. And so to start things off, we're going to be looking at, it's essentially literally the exact same map as it was in 2022, as neither had any special elections. And so to start things off with the national environment, it's not looking too strong right now. To lead things off, the president, he has relatively low approval ratings, the lowest of any recorded president at this point in their term. And so, as we can see from the past few presidents, Obama at this point in time was +9, Biden was +5, and even in Trump's first term, he was a bit above with -14. Now he's at -15. He's underwater essentially on every single issue and in every single state, even amongst 2024 voters that went Trump and that went Biden and then Trump in 2024. And he's underwater with a majority of adults in quite a few states, even plenty that he won, and is barely above water in quite a few, with the exception of Idaho, which is actually his the highest. Rather than that, he doesn't have any above 15 other than Wyoming and Idaho. So that's relatively bad news, even in some of these safer states. Even with 2024 voters, he's almost breaking in Ohio, in Kansas, and in Utah, as well as in Iowa. So some of those swingier states that are on the outside, that are generally likely Republican. Direction the country is continuing to suffer, but that's as expected, as we saw 4 years ago. It's probably going to spike over the course of the month. Right now we're at -12.3. It's a bit higher than it actually was 4 years ago, but not by much. And this spike could end up coming at some point over the next few weeks. Generally, the party out of power in the White House does relatively poorly in the midterms. It's a lot more varied for governors because they're a lot less, because they're not federal races, so they're less federalized. But nowadays, there's less split ticket voting as well, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. As we actually have the least split ticket states that we've seen in a long time. We have Kansas, Vermont, New Hampshire, which could be counted as a swing state. But then we just have Kansas, Vermont, and Kentucky for the true three that went for the presidential candidate that they voted for by more than 10 that has an opposite party at the governorship level. Even five, even for that 5 point, that still stays true. Other than Virginia, if you do 5 or more, then Virginia is another split ticket state. It has a Republican governor, but as we said, likely it will end up flipping blue, which means that it will drop down to just those 3. And then actually you'd add in Arizona because Trump did win it by 5.5, and they do have a Democratic governor. So interestingly, that would be an added one on there. So that's actually going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 currently to drop down to 4, which is still one of the lowest that we've seen in a long time. If you look back in the past, you can see quite a few split tickets. Even back in 2016, Montana had a Democratic governor. West Virginia had a Democratic governor. Louisiana had a Democratic governor in 2015. Alaska had an independent. You had Republicans winning elections in Maryland, Massachusetts. Republican in Maine, Illinois, Democrat won in Pennsylvania, but that was still a swingy state at that point in time. Republican in New Jersey in Chris Christie. Democrat in Missouri. So going back quite a bit, and then here's Andy Beshear's father as a Democrat in Kentucky in 2011, Democrat in Arkansas, Republicans in a few blue states across the board. So it's definitely more polarized, which means that you can use more of the national level statistics in order to gauge where the state might vote than you really ever have before. So here we have a graph of governor favorability ratings, which we will get to in a bit, but there's only one underwater, and it now sticks out like a sore thumb, which is Iowa. Kim Reynolds is retiring in 2026 because she is the only one that has a negative approval rating, and so that is definitely going to harm her there, but the next lowest is Janet Mills, only at +2 in Maine, and then is Dan McKee in Rhode Island. But we'll be using this as a way to generally, it's a way to see how much independent support as well as actual split ticket voting might be possible for some of these candidates in an election. Like, for example, Josh Shapiro might be able to get quite a bit of a moderate Republican vote, which is exactly what we saw, and that's how he won so big in 2022. So, finally, to start things off, let's go over to the sheet here, and what we have is sort by raw margin. We're going to go in order of, and I did it wrong again, in order of least competitive to most competitive. We're going to be going through every single race. So, what we're going to start off with, obviously, is Idaho, expected to be the least competitive. We have here, this is going to be by far a safe margin. We're going to be doing the 5-point this time. Just to make things a bit more variable, you can see that I'm actually going to bump it up here so that's consistent. No. There we go. Okay, and so then what we end up having here is really nothing changed, interestingly, but here's the map as of 2022. But to start things off in Idaho, this is expected to be a very, very large margin, 38 points for the Republican. If we look down here, we can see that Brad Little is not term limited, so then you'll have the incumbency factor, and there's literally not really anybody on the Democratic side. There's not even a section for it here, and there's never really any strong candidates one way or the other. For the Democrats, it is Idaho, so for that reason alone, it's basically going to be a safe, it's going to be a safe red state, the safest in the country. Second place is going to be Vermont, which is a very, very interesting state, obviously, as you know. But Phil Scott wins by ridiculously large margins every single election. He is the most liked governor in the entire country at +52. Second place is North Dakota, but the most popular governor in the entire country. He is undecided as of right now, but he is likely to run for re-election. He won in 2024 by 51.5 points, which is a huge amount. He won by 47 in 2022. These two states elect their governors every 2 years. And so he's expected to win by a huge margin, around 38.5, which is actually relatively low. But he did win by only 15 in 2018. That was his second term though, so that is somewhat expected there. But he wins usually by huge margins. But even in 2022, when he ran alongside Biden, he won by 41, and then in 2024, when he ran alongside Harris, he won by 51. So he's expected to win by a relatively large amount either way. Next is going to be Maryland, where we do have another incumbency here in where is it? There we go. In Wes Moore, very blue state, expected to stay blue, one of the most reliably Democratic states in the nation. And so literally all we have is Wes Moore versus Larry Hogan. Is even not that competitive. Larry Hogan is the ex-governor of of Maryland. He originally won in 2014 during that very strong red wave year. Managed to hold on in 2018. Same thing along with Baker and Massachusetts. This cycle, Maryland and Massachusetts are very, very, very similar. They're generally very similar in a lot of ways, but they're very similar this cycle especially. Hogan won by just under 12 in 2018. And then he was term limited in 2022, but because of the Maryland Constitution, there's no actual term limits. You just can't have 3 consecutive terms. So he could run again. And so that's going to be the closest, but that right there is even a 14-point lead, 3.5-point margin of error. 10% undecided, even if it went there 48, that's still not very competitive. So still, it's expected to be very, very uncompetitive. But if Larry Hogan does enter the race, it would get a lot more competitive. But as of right now, it's going to be the safest blue race in the entire country. Then it's going to be Massachusetts, 30.2. As I said, they're very, very similar. We have the exact same pattern. Both of them were red and then flipped blue in 2022. Healy only won by 29, though, 3 points behind, but still expected to carry by a lot. Maura Healey is the incumbent there, and so she is officially running. Same with Wes Moore. They both officially announced. And their favorability ratings are both right around 30 points, which is very strong. Republican primary, there's not really anyone very, very strong. There's not necessarily a poor candidate necessarily, but minority leader of the Massachusetts Senate would definitely make things a bit more competitive within a few more points, but still very, very unlikely to have anything close to a competitive race here in Massachusetts. Just over a 30-point margin expected as of right now. Then we have Arkansas. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is the governor here. You can see that she is, in fact, running in 2026. She's positive approval rating of plus 22. So that's definitely going to help carry things for her there. And so with that, it's really all. It's going to be 29.5 points. That's quite a bit of an improvement from 27.8. That's actually an improvement, likely just because of that incumbency status that she didn't have before. Next, we have Hawaii, another 25.5-point margin. This is going to be for Green. Won it by 26.4 in 2022. He is now the incumbent governor, though. There's really nobody on the Republican side either. So there's literally not really any shot here, just a generic Republican there. Wyoming, 25, the reddest state in the entire country. And so here we literally just we do have Mark Gordon, who is term limited this cycle, but he has positive 41 approval rating. So we do have candidate for governor in 2022 who is running, Brent Byen, but if we do end up having Secretary of State, he said he will run if Hageman doesn't run, who is the current U.S. representative. But if you do end up having Gray run or Hageman, if Hageman runs, then that would be a strong showing most likely. But as of right now, either one is generally possible, but there's nobody on the Democratic side. So it's just a generic Democrat, and they're expected to not do very well, and especially in such a strong state as Wyoming. South Dakota is another strong red state. Kristi Noem did vacate, obviously, as she was given a position in Trump's cabinet. And since then, we do have Larry Roden, but he is not run. He has yet to announce, but he has not officially stated whether or not he will run. We do have the Speaker of the South Dakota House of Representatives, as well as the U.S. Representative for the at-large congressional district. So there could end up being a showdown there. But we do have a college student who's running on the Democratic side, and we have a web developer for the independents, but there's no real actual candidates here running. So it's just going to be a very strong Republican state there. Tennessee, 23.1 points, a very strong state. We now have Marsha Blackburn, who's just announced that she's going to be running here. Bill Lee is term limited, won by 32 points. But now we do have the race with Marsha Blackburn joining. John Rose retired from the 6th district to run for, or actually didn't retire, but is running for governor here. Marsha Blackburn did announce she is likely to carry uh, herself to victory here. So that's going to be, yeah, against Rose, you literally have 71-13. Very easily will be able to pull off the nomination for the Republicans. And we have the Memphis City Councilor, who isn't very, son of former Governor Prentice Cooper. This may end up helping. But if he does end up running, that could tighten it up a little bit. Really depends on what happens. But um, in the end, it is going to be most likely very non-competitive, and the Republicans are going to be able to hold on to that one. Same thing in Nebraska, where we have Jim Pillen. He's not the most liked governor. He's actually the least out of these 5 somewhat similar plains states, with only positive 11, but he is running for re-election, and he's expected to win by around 21.5 points. He won by 23.4 in 2022, though. But because of the bluer national environment and the continued leftward trends in the state, you can expect it's going to be a little bit tighter. Alabama, we have Senator Tommy Tuberville, who is retiring from the Senate. He will not run for re-election because he's going to run for governor, as Kay Ivey is term limited. But she has a very strong positive approval rating, and Tuberville is obviously a strong senator there, and so with that, he is likely to just be able to cruise to the that's ancient, so cruise to that. Plus, the only real test that there could be would be Doug Jones, which would actually be funny because this would be the second election between Tuberville and Jones if he does end up running, because that's actually exactly what happened in 2020 for that seat there, Tuberville versus Jones. Jones actually flipped that seat in a special election after Shelby retired, I believe. No, it's the wrong seat. So, yeah, after Shelby retired then, but then Katie Britt. No, okay, so that would be the different election then. That would actually probably be from Sessions. Yes, Jeff Sessions retired. And so he actually ran unopposed. This is the last time an incumbent senator was reelected unopposed. And so with that, then we have Jeff Sessions retired. And with that very low turnout special election with Roy Moore, who actually was a very, very troubled candidate, Doug Jones ended up narrowly winning in an upset. And so he had assault cases. And so, but then he did end up losing the seat to Tuberville by not that poor of an amount, just over 20 points, which is a very strong margin for a Democrat in Alabama. But if he does end up running again, I don't expect that he would be able to win, though, just again because it is, in fact, Alabama. But that would get it down below that 20-point margin. In California, this is a strong blue state. It's 19.6. We have term limited Gavin Newsom here, a plus 13. And so with that, we do have a large field here. It is California. It's a large state, a lot of people. You have Katie Porter, Tony Thurmond. You have the former mayor of Los Angeles, Villaraigosa. You have Betty Yee. You have Tony Atkins. So quite a few candidates. This is going to be a large primary. But for the Republican Party, you don't have any necessarily very strong candidates. So that's going to be the if Kevin McCarthy run, it could have narrowed it down, but he's not. So that's going to really mean that's just going to be basically a carry away for the Democrats here before much of anything. So that's going to be a strong Democratic state. Newsom, who's I forgot to switch back. Newsom, who has somewhat low popularity, still did end up winning by 18.5 points in 2022. So that's not going to be a very competitive race. Oklahoma, 19.5 is actually a very strong underperformer in Kevin's state, but he is term limited, and it was also due to Hoffmeister actually flipped parties. But just in general, due to the overall environment in Oklahoma, depending on what Democrat they end up running, minority leader of the Oklahoma House of Representatives, this could end up making things a bit tighter. than generally things would be, but especially if there's a competitive Republican primary, obviously there could be some messaging here for Munson, but most likely it's going to be a relatively strong state either way. A good margin for Democrats in Oklahoma would be just around 15 points, so it's not going to be competitive by any means either way, but it could get a bit more so. Colorado 16.8. This is a very strong margin, but actually worse than Polis did. Polis is term limited in 2026. He's a positive approval rating of 24. But he is term limited, so he's not going to be able to run again. But we already have Bennett, the Democratic senator, said that he is going to run, but he's going to have to run in a primary against the attorney general. So that's going to be somewhat of an interesting race there. But that's going to be a little bit difficult for both of them to be able to pull. It's going to make things a bit more competitive for the overall race because they're gonna have to spend a bit of money against each other. But most likely Bennett is gonna end up winning the nomination without too much difficulty, but there is still a lot of undecideds. And then you don't have any necessarily very strong candidates here, but you do have Jason Clark, who was candidate for governor in 2014. Doesn't look like he actually was able to get any specific nominations, but you do have the former U.S. representative and candidate for governor in 2018, 2022. Lopez is most likely going to be the largest candidate there with name recognition, but it is still going to be a safe Democratic state, very left trending, one of the most left trending in the entire nation, if not the most left trending in the entire nation, 3.48. It actually has the most left trending in the entire nation, barely more so than Georgia. 3.48 leftward trend in general, so that's going to be a very strong trend in that direction. Rhode Island is going to have basically the exact same margin, 16.8, which is actually relatively low, but dropping from 2022. McKee has a very, very low approval rating of +5, the third lowest in the entire country. But it is still Rhode Island, and so there's a strong, safely blue state, and B, it's a relatively small state by population, so there's not really any strong Republican candidates. You have the minority leader of the Rhode Island Senate, likely going to end up winning that nomination, De La Cruz, but even then, it's a very strong blue state, so most likely it is going to end up voting Lamont in. It actually did vote red as recently as 2006, but then flipped the seat for an independent in 2010. Chaffee won by 2.5, but then that's actually a flip in 2014. Even in red wave year 2014, it did vote blue. So most likely, it's going to end up being a Democrat winning there. Connecticut, 15.8 points is going to be the number here. Lamont only won by 13, but he is likely to run for re-election, so thus he will have the incumbency advantage. He is one of the most popular governors out there. Strong comparison to Rhode Island. He's at +34. So there's very, very few that are ahead of him. And so Republican nomination, you literally don't have anybody else on here with any name recognition. So most likely there's not going to be anyone who's actually able to truly get a name recognition against Lamont. He is most likely going to carry that state by potentially up to 20 points. Illinois, you have J.B. Pritzker running for a third term. He won in 2022 by 12.5 points. In 2018, he flipped the state by 15.5 against incumbent Rauner, who had won in the red wave of 2014. So he's a relatively popular governor. He's at +19, right around in the middle of the pack. And so there's nothing necessarily very strong about him necessarily, but he's not unpopular by any means either. And so now you do have Juliana Stratton's running for U.S. Senate, so his running mate will have to change. But then we do have the Republicans. There's nobody here that's necessarily very strong. And you actually don't have the senator here who won Barack Obama's seat in 2010. So even then, that's the only real candidate that could even really make this very competitive. But all of the predictors have this safe or solid Democrat, and so it's going to be a very strong Democratic state. Pennsylvania, 12.5. Now we're getting right to the edge of the safe states. This is the last safe state, the state of Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro won by 14.8% in 2022, a huge overperformer. Now, some of that is definitely also in the unpopularity of the candidate that he ran against, Doug Mastriano, but that's still a large margin, especially compared to how some of the other candidates did in Pennsylvania on that same ballot. But the Republican primary, you have Stacey Garrity, the state treasurer, and this could potentially make things a bit more competitive. Doug Mastriano would be a very poor choice for the Republicans to make. But and Dave Sunday is the attorney general. If he had run, that could have made things a bit more competitive because he actually did win on the exact same ballot as Josh Shapiro. But so that's really going to be the main race. Is probably going to be Garrity. And so you can see Garrity, but most people are undecided. Scott Perry also could have potentially run as well, but he is most likely running for re-election. But there's no polls yet, but he is likely to win this state by quite a bit. He's a strong overperformer there. So he has won every single race, every single formal election that he has been in. So he's a strong overperformer and he will likely do well. New York, here we have a likely race. This is going to be a likely race, quite a bit better than in 2022. Kathy Hochul winning by 6.5 points. This is her second. This is going to be her second full term. After she was elected to her first full term in her own right in 2022 after the retirement of Andrew Cuomo. So that's going to be the main thing there, but she does have a somewhat lowish approval rating, not very poor, but a little bit, definitely in the third quartile, 12 points. And considering how poor she did last time, it's a bit concerning. So her own lieutenant governor is actually running against her in the primaries. And the more concern is actually going to be for the Republican side, where we actually end up having Elise Stefanik. And so Mike Lawler announced that he will sit out. He will sit out the governor's election, run for re-election there. But now Stefanik is running, and she's actually a bit, I believe, of a little bit of an underperformer. But now we do have, and Trump is basically on her side and will likely endorse her. But most likely, she's not an extremely strong candidate, and now Hochul does outright have the incumbency, so that will most likely end up being a strong blue state there. South Carolina is going to be likely red here. It was safe in 2022, but that was because McMaster was an incumbent, and he is term limited in 2026. He's relatively popular, but it is still not a ridiculously blue state. It's only 8.4, which would mean 16.8 on a general level, but it's likely going to be a blue environment. It was basically perfectly tied in 2022, so it will likely be a bit bluer than that, which means that obviously South Carolina will move with it. And so there's not really anybody very strong here. We do have the lieutenant governor who's potentially going to run up here, and also Nancy Mace is running. But the question is, and we also have the attorney general, so it's going to be a bit of a match up in the primary. But we don't have any strong Democratic candidates. That's definitely going to hurt things. But if we do end up having any strong potential candidates here, or if Johnson ends up being a strong performer, then the race could tighten up even more. Or if he ends up being a slight underperformer and things are going relatively poorly, then obviously it will drop. Next is Texas, where Greg Abbott won by 11 points in 2022. He's expected to shrink that margin just a little bit, literally 0.2 of a point in Texas. This completely depends on who ends up running here, as we don't have any actual candidates here, though. Greg Abbott is running, and the Democratic primary, we actually don't have. If Beto O'Rourke runs, then it would obviously probably drop a little bit more, closer to around 5 to 6 points, but not enough to flip all the way. He's a relatively popular candidate. He's a bit on the low side, right, matched with Hochul at plus 12. Next, we are going down to the state of Maine, where we have 9.7 points. This is going to be another likely state on the map here. Maine is, there's an incumbency that is ending with Janet Mills. She's only at +2, though, the least liked above water in the entire country. But now she is obviously term limited. But Angus King III, the son of the U.S. Senator Angus King, and also was the former governor, is running, and he is likely going to cruise to the nomination. Um, but there is in theory a chance that he will end up losing it to someone like potentially Troy Jackson, who has nominations from more of the liberal wing of the party, but most likely he could end up winning it. And then you don't really have any strong candidates on the Republican side, which is the main problem here. It could end up being a relatively tight race with the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, but you have to know getting name recognition out there, and that's going to be something that Angus King basically comes with for free because of his father's name there. So that's going to be the main issue for Republicans there, and that's why they're likely going to lose this race by 9 points or so. And then the last two likely races are in New Mexico and Minnesota. New Mexico and Minnesota in that order. New Mexico, to start things off, Grisham is term limited. Democratic primary, we have the Bernalillo County District Attorney, former mayor of Las Cruces, and the former U.S. representative from the 1st Congressional District. None of these are extremely strong candidates, at which point they'd have like large statewide name recognition. But we have even poorer candidates for the Republicans, and also just as a slightly blue state in general, with a PVI of -3.6. So it's expected to go blue by around 8.5 points. Minnesota 8.3, we have Tim Walz, who is likely to run for re-election, but he is, as of right now, undecided. He has a positive approval rating of +14, which is a little bit on the low end, but a little bit more than the 2 that we were talking about earlier. But he did win by 7.7 on the DFL ticket, being Democratic Farmer Labor, which is a party coalition that only exists in Minnesota, in 2022. And so he is expected to, and that's why it's a different color here, DFL. He is expected to win the nomination there. But since the adoption of 4-year terms, no Minnesota governor has been elected to a third term. So he would be the first to do that if he does end up running. His decision is expected in September, so we'll be waiting for that in a month. And if he doesn't run, then the Secretary of State says he will run instead. And the Republican field, there's not really anyone strong. We have a nominee for governor in 2022, Scott Jensen. But he did lose, obviously, by 7.7. If it ends up being a rematch, it would probably increase even more because rematches go relatively poorly. And so with all of that, it's mostly going to be a likely blue state there. And so now we are in the competitive races. These competitive races are Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, Alaska, Kansas, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, Florida, and New Hampshire. And we are tied 19-19 with 12 races outgoing as of right now. So these are going to be the races to watch over the course of the cycle. First off is going to be New Hampshire, 7.8 points in New Hampshire for not Sununu, because it's every 2 years, for Kelly Ayotte. She's somewhat well-liked, +13 approval rating, not insanely high, but she did, of course, win by 9.3 on the same ballot that Kamala Harris won the state by 4. So that's a 13-point split ticket voting, which means that she's a relatively strong candidate in that sense. But we don't have anyone for the Republicans at all. Wait, no, sorry, for the Democrats, there's Tom Sherman. I missed flipping parties. We did like 4 Democrats in a row. So we do have former state senator and nominee for governor in 2022, but obviously since he lost to Sununu by 15.5, that's not necessarily going to be exactly a strong sign that he'll be able to perform extremely well here, so that's going to be a probable race on the map. Next up, we do have the state of Kansas, 7.4 points, another probable race here. And this is because we have an outgoing Democratic administration, and with Laura Kelly, relatively popular as well, plus 31 approval rating. By relatively popular, I mean very popular. And so she won by 2.2 in 2022 after flipping the seat by 5 in 2018, piggybacking off of the very unpopular Brownback administration, and so then was able to win even re-election in 2022, most likely just due to the results of the Dobbs decision there. And so what we're going to be looking at here, though, is since she is term limited, this is almost an easy flip for the Republicans. We have former Governor Jeff Colyer. We also have President of the Kansas Senate, Secretary of State, and Insurance Commissioner are all running. And then for the Democrats, we'd have the Minority Leader of the Kansas Senate, and we potentially do have the Secretary of Transportation, but the best option would have probably been Lieutenant Governor of Kansas with David Toland, but he did decline to run, so that basically seals the fate for the Democrats that they will in fact lose this race. But just based on the piggybacking off of the popular Democrat, that will probably give some form of coattails, if you will, in the state of Kansas. Then we have Ohio, a 6.4 point margin. For Vivek Ramaswamy here, most likely is going to be the nominee. Now, Mike DeWine is term limited, and he won in a landslide in 2022 by 25 points. He only lost 3 counties. And so he most likely is going to win the he's almost certain to win the primaries. And so with that, now it's down to the Democrats who will end up running. Amy Acton is running relatively well, but relatively close, and she is generally, you could say, she is the presumptive nominee unless Sherrod Brown jumps in the race. But if you exclude Sherrod Brown, Herb and Tim Ryan, she actually does narrowly beat Tim Ryan out. So even if Tim Ryan does run, then obviously it would be there. But Sherrod Brown, if he ends up running, which would be a relatively strong showing for him, he would probably end up beating Acton. And there is no and so the hypothetical polling between Ramaswamy and Ryan is actually worse than against Amy Acton, but there is none against Sherrod Brown. So that's going to be up in the air there. But that might be a relatively competitive race, and it actually would be a bit of a surprise flip on election night for the Democrats. Another one would be Florida, and it's actually probably less likely than Ohio, but the margin is likely going to be a bit closer. DeSantis won by 19.5 in 2022, a large margin, much more than expected, especially considering that it's improving off of his 0.39 point margin in 2018. And so with that, we have Jason Pizzo, an independent, who is a former Democratic minority leader of the Florida Senate. But the Republican Party, we have Byron Donalds, the U.S. representative for the 19th Congressional District, and Casey DeSantis may end up running, at which point she actually would win against Byron Donalds, but it would be a relatively competitive primary. That would be interesting to see. Democratic primary, we have David Jolly. There's actually a very strong candidate, former Republican U.S. representative. He did relatively well. He then flipped parties. So that's going to be a very interesting candidate there. So that's going to be an interesting showdown. That's why the margin's somewhat low, is because he might be able to get he'd be kind of like Dan Osborne in Nebraska. He'll be able to get Democrats and some moderate Republicans as well who might not approve as much of the DeSantis campaign now as they did. But he is at plus 16, so it's not that poor of an approval rating. We'll just have to see how things go. Next up, we have the state of Oregon, 5.8 points. So now we are getting a bit lower here. That's going to be the next probable rating is going to be for the relatively unpopular Tina Kotek may end up running for re-election, undecided as of right now, but she only won by 3.5 in 2022. This would be a sleeper flip for the Republicans, no doubt. It's a very blue state, continually left trending, but she has not announced whether or not she will run. But there is literally not really anybody for the Republicans, so that's going to be just a generic Republican versus Kotek. She does end up winning. Nevada, 5.1, which is going to be the final the final probable race is going to be a strong win for Lombardo. He is a very strong candidate. He defeated incumbent Sisolak by 1.5 points in 2022, even though it's a relatively favorable national environment. He's positive 21 with approval rating, and it's a very Republican trending state. All of that combined ends up showing that it could end up being a very strong Republican win. Depends on how well Aaron Ford ends up doing. He is currently the Attorney General. He won on the same ticket as Lombardo, so that is relatively strong showing in and of itself, but it is still likely as of right now to be a relatively high margin. Then we go down to lean, which are anything from 2 to 5 points, and we start off with Alaska. This is assuming, obviously, and it's looking more and more likely, but we can't say for sure. We have Mike Dunleavy, who is term limited in 2026, and right now we may have Mary Peltola running. And also Tom Bigich, the uncle of U.S. Representative Nick Bigich, but he's also he's the minority leader of the Alaska Senate for a few years for a large district from Juneau. And so that's around Anchorage, actually. So that's really going to depend on if Peltola ends up running, as you can see, tying with Bigich in the primaries, but does better, but actually then ends up doing pretty good against Dahlstrom. But it could end up being between Bigich and Peltola, depending on how well they end up doing. But most likely, one of these Republican candidates, most potentially Dahlstrom, will end up winning here. Murkowski could end up running here, but most likely she will stay in the Senate for right now. But that could end up becoming a relatively competitive state if things end up going well for the Democrats, the national environment, if we see more signs of a blue wave, and especially if Peltola or Bigich actually end up being the nominee. Now we are down to the final four. Arizona, 2.3 points for current incumbent. There we go. For current incumbent Katie Hobbs, she's undecided, but she's plus 18, which is relatively high. She only won against Carrie Lake by 2/3 of a point, though, and we've seen how weak of a candidate Carrie Lake is, considering that she lost to Ruben Gallego by 2.5 on the same ballot that Donald Trump won the state by 5.5. So she's a relatively poor candidate, which means that most likely, considering the fact that she did relatively well against Hobbs, means that Hobbs is also a weak candidate. So just based on that deduction alone, you can generally guess that she's a relatively below standard candidate, but she is likely running for re-election, and she will most likely carry herself to win that nomination. Andy Biggs is running, though, so that could potentially get relatively strong, but his district performed a bit more Democratic, according to the War Wins Above Replacement rating by split ticket. Whether or not that's weakness of Biggs or strengths by the Democrats is not 100% sure, though, but now we wait then to see how things go, but Biggs is most likely going to win that primary, but the polling of Hobbs versus Biggs generally does have Hobbs ahead of Biggs consistently with everything, even somewhat recently. Even the Republican pollster that did it in early April had Hobbs ahead by 4. So it's likely it'll end up being still relatively close, because competitive states always are based on how much funding they put for messaging and such. But it will end up being a close state. Then we end up going to Iowa, 2.3 points here in Iowa. And so why is Wisconsin not on here? All right, I have no idea why Wisconsin is not on here, and so that is annoying me. Yeah, I literally just skipped it, so I think, yep, that would be why it literally skipped the, okay, so there, that's gonna benefit there. All right, so just a bit of unexpected. I was wondering why on earth it wasn't, okay. All right, so now we end up with Wisconsin is probably going to be somewhere in the middle here. It's not going to be quite as blue as, well, Evers is retiring, so that's going to be huge. He is the only candidate who is retiring in 2026. Everyone else is either term limited or is running or is unannounced. So he is the only candidate who has made a decision to not run for re-election. And so with that, then is going to be an open competitive primary, as well as a competitive race as well. The Republicans have Washington County Executive. Tom Tiffany might end up running as well. That'll be a relatively strong candidate. Wisconsin College Republicans did endorse him, which means that he might end up getting a bit more of the youth vote, which is critical for a Republican to be able to win if they can whittle away at some of that there. But Mandela Barnes, former lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, nominee for U.S. Senate, did relatively well. And then you have Sarah Rodriguez, lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, did jump in the race. So, and we don't really have any polls, though. It is a pure toss-up everywhere right now. But as of right now, obviously, we have a strong incumbency and everything else. So it's probably going to be a very narrow margin there, probably of around, did that wrong again. Probably going to be a very, very low margin of 1.3%, which is actually going to be after Iowa, but I had forgotten it, so I kind of have to put it in there. So there's Wisconsin. I tweaked this a little bit, so that's how that got messed up. Next up, we do have the state of Iowa. This one's probably going to be very close, not only because we actually, oh no, the other one that's retiring is Kim Reynolds, -7. But we do actually likely have a very, very competitive race here. We have 3 people that are running for against each other. Most likely, Feenstra is going to end up winning the nomination just based on a larger. Also got the endorsements from multiple high up people, but also has a larger overall name recognition. But we have Rob Sand, the auditor of state, the only Democrat to win statewide this decade in Iowa, is running. And so he's already done relatively well so far. And so we also have Tim Walz with an endorsement there for Sand. He is likely to win that race there. So that's going to make it very, very competitive. But alas, it is still Iowa. So it will likely still go red, but by a very, very slim amount. So that's probably going to end up being a pretty competitive race there. That's going to be narrowly lean. Then we end up with Michigan and Georgia, the final 2, which are expected to go tilt blue. So Georgia is going to be a flip, but Michigan, which is expected to be by 0.8, is not. Whitmer is term limited, though, but she's relatively popular, +22. And so with that, then Gretchen Whitmer obviously is term limited. Mike Duggan is an independent. He has a very high approval rating, especially for a mayor of Detroit. So that's going to be taking away quite a few votes, but he's also taking a lot of votes statewide from Republicans as well. Jocelyn Benson is the general best candidate as of right now, the Secretary of State, but Gilchrist is a not very poor candidate. Republicans also have a strong bench here. The former Michigan Attorney General, we have John James, who is the U.S. representative from the 10th Congressional District and U.S. Senate nominee for U.S. Senate in 2018 and 2020. He did relatively well. So all of that in general, but Benson does actually win in a 3-way against all of them, but very, very narrowly, well within the margin of error. So as of right now, it is 0.8, but just based off of course, the Democratic, popular, outgoing administration, as well as an expected Democratic-friendly year, that will be tilt blue. And then the flip for the Democrats that makes up for the loss in Kansas is going to be Georgia, which is going to be tilt blue. This is the best pickup opportunity for the Democrats. I'm literally by half a point. And this is because Brian Kemp is term limited, and he's relatively popular. He's +34. So very, very popular. That's how he ended up winning by 7.5 points in 2022. But it's also because it was a rematch. So if If Stacey Abrams runs and then ends up winning the nomination, then it will immediately flip to tilt R. But if we end up having Keisha Lance Bottoms, the former mayor of Atlanta, then she will be able to get a lot more Democratic votes, increased turnout, etc., which is exactly what the Democrats need, and also be able to get more from the left trending suburbs. So that will help the Democrats end up pulling off a win there. The Republicans have Burt Jones and Chris Carr who are running. If Marjorie Taylor Greene did decline. Chris Carr, the Attorney General, and the Lieutenant Governor are in a matchup, though. Burt Jones, very, very narrow lead, but 73% are undecided. But down, there's literally no polls here yet. Stacey Abrams does sadly actually win the primary polls if she were to run, but this was actually before anyone else was here, so that's not necessarily anything worth putting much look into. Salvador's Crystal Ball actually does have it lean R, but everyone else has it as a pure toss-up, and I actually have it just purely, basically purely based off of the natural environment, D plus 0.5 to finish off the map, staying at 26-24 after, after the 2024 being 27-23, and then the flip in Virginia. So, with all of that, there is every single state, the race explained for the governors in 2026. Thank you all so much for watching, especially if you watched all the way through. And make sure to subscribe if you are not already. Have a fantastic rest of your day.